Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning, I'm Jeff Kellam, and welcome to this week's edition of Encounter. I'm going to pull a Mark Kimblin this week. You know, Mark, one of our co-hosts, often introduces a new Methodist pastor who's moved into the area because there's a Methodist church on every country corner and they move every 6 months or so. Don't tell Mark I said that. We Presbyterians are a little bit more rare breed, and we only move once every 15, 20 years. We get kind of stuck at our churches. And that's not true either. That's an exaggeration. But it's my pleasure to introduce a new minister to our area. She's the pastor at the Northminster Presbyterian Church in Endwell, right across the street from the main Endwell High School. Rachel Helgeson, welcome, not only to Encounter, but to the Triple Cities. Now, you've been out west, and you've been in the Midwest. In fact, I like the way it was put in your bio. I can't find it now. Where is it? Oh, there it is, yes. You appreciate both Southern hospitality and Midwestern grit. And now you're back in the Northeast. Yep. You and your husband were in New York City doing music.
Yes.
What were you doing with music in New York City? There's a lot of possibilities.
We're just married about 6 months before we moved to New York City. My husband worked in the Lower East Side as a music teacher, and it was at a charter school, so it was kind of neat. There were kids that were community area kids who lived in poor school districts, and also kids that were from Soho that he also taught that were from more affluent areas. So, but he was able to teach like rock band and jazz band and beginning band, and the kids wanted to be there. All the kids wanted to be there, and he thought it was really interesting because they all came from different backgrounds, you know.
Right.
And there was also a large Chinese community because it was down in that part of town. So, it was a really interesting time for him. And I was doing temp work to keep things going, but I was also traveling in and out of the city, working as an opera singer, a director, and a stage manager in the opera world. So part of being in the opera world is that you base yourself someplace. New York City is a good place to base yourself because a lot of auditions and things come through there. Right. And then you do some things in the city, but then you come in and out and go to a gig for about a month and come back.
Yes. Yeah. And so the opera world, how far did that extend from New York?
Let's see, I was at Detroit and Michigan Opera Theater at one point. I was in North Carolina with Opera Carolina. I worked at Wolf Trap in Virginia, and the little small company up in Vermont, which had just started. I'd auditioned in New York City. It was Green Mountain Opera Festival, which was pretty neat to be like the pilot young artist for that group. Was
that in Stowe or in Broome?
Yes.
In Stowe, Yep. So when you were in college, you were a music and theater major.
Yes, I was a double major with a peace studies minor.
Yep. So full disclosure, you and I went to the same college.
Yes.
WNBF's Roger Neal also went to Westminster College in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania. When I was there, it was the horse and buggy days. But it's still the horse and buggy days.
There are still horse and buggies there.
Because it's in the heart of Amish land. And it was fascinating, the culture of the college here. And then you walk a couple of blocks and you've got Amish buggies coming down the street and hitching up to the hitching post to go to the bank and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I remember actually my grandparents coming to visit me at college, and they spent more time at the cheese market where the Amish had made the cheese than they did on my college campus. But they were really proud of me, but they wanted to have some Amish cheese.
So your call to ministry came a little bit later. You weren't a religion major in college, but your father is a pastor.
Yes.
And so where was the turn for you in your vocation?
Well, it's kind of interesting. Like, child me knew that I wanted to be a pastor at some point, but I think I was maybe 5. My parents asked what I wanted to be, and I said, I want to be a musician like my mom, because my mom is a musician and she was a singer, and my dad was a pastor, and they were like, oh, you're probably going to have to pick one.
Right.
And I was like, okay, well then I want to be a musician. But fast forward, I was in New York City and kind of being scouted by some folks at that point in time. So sort of the impetus of when your career could take off and do some things. And I was working with a particular coach, and in the coaching, she said to me, "Rachel, what do you want to do next?" And I had answered that question often. Musicians answer that all the time because you have to be thinking about what the next gig or the gig after that. And so I sort of had a prepared answer, but that's not what came out of my mouth. What came out of my mouth is I want to be a pastor.
That must have surprised your coach.
Yes. She just sort of looked at me and kind of skipped over it, which was strange for a New Yorker because usually they're like, tell you, but she just was like, okay, well, let's keep singing. But it stuck with me, and I went home and talked to my husband about it, and I thought for sure he was going to be like, that's crazy, but he was like, well, if this is what God's calling you to do, then let's check it out. Let's see if this is what you are called to do. I was like, you weren't supposed to say that. And then I went to my pastor in New York City. His name's Charles Brewster, and I thought for sure he was going to say, well, that doesn't make any sense. And he was like, oh, Rachel, that's wonderful. I could totally see you doing that. So I just started to explore and see what happened. And after some discernment, ended up at seminary in Louisville, Presbyterian Seminary in Kentucky.
Yeah. So. And what took you to Kentucky?
That was also an unexpected turn too, because we were living in New York City. So when I would talk to folks about Kentucky, it wasn't even initially on my radar, truthfully. But one of my friends from Westminster, who was a pastor, had graduated from there and said, have you thought about this? And I was like, Kentucky?
They have a seminary right there in New York, a good one.
Yes, they do. Yeah. But I think God took me to Kentucky because I needed space to grow as a pastor and away from the identity that I had built as a musician. Not that my gifts as a musician waned, but that I needed to spend some time to get some pastoral authority and learn who I would be in that. So Kentucky was sort of my journey, as part of what helped me re-identify who I am, but also how God has made me as a pastor and as a musician. So.
And your work in Kentucky at Louisville Seminary led you to a pastoral residency in Dallas, Texas.
Yes.
Lilly Pastoral Residency. Explain what that means.
Sure. So you might have heard
Lilly Foundation.
Lilly Foundation.
Yeah.
Lilly Foundation donates towards pastoral residencies. That was one of the things that Eli Lilly actually felt very strongly about, is to try to help train leaders in faith communities. And it's not just limited to Presbyterians. The cohort that I was part of in Dallas had an Episcopalian, Baptists, Methodists, and two Presbyterians. So, but it was to try to help give them space to learn, and to learn in a bigger church, but also learn from different folks who specialize in things. So it was a really unique opportunity. It's sort of like how doctors do a residency program. They're fully a doctor, but they're also still learning.
Yes.
And so the Lilly Pastoral Residency was sort of like that. In the Presbyterian system, we used to have a thing called assistant pastors, where they used to do that. Well, the Lilly Pastoral Residency sort of does that, where you're ordained, but you're not installed, so it means that you're not staying there. You're only going to be there for 2 years. But I was ordained to the position, and I learned from folks who were working. My senior pastor, who is Joe Clifford, who's now at Myers Park Presbyterian Church in Charlotte. Some Christian educators who are really fine in that area. Bruce Buchanan, who at the time, he just recently retired, but he was the associate pastor for the Stew Pot and for the church, and so, which is a homeless shelter. So I got to see things firsthand and learn from folks who were teaching other people how, about ministry, but also living into that fully, into their call. So, and the point was, and Joe Clifford would say this to me all the time, was that it was not for me to stay in Dallas. It was to get me ready for whatever was next that God was calling me to, and to send me out into the world and do the next thing, which I so appreciate. I had that opportunity.
Your work too in Dallas and led you to work with the homeless population. And then you had another touch with homelessness. Was that in in the Midwest? You were.
Yes, in Mount Vernon, Illinois. That was my first solo pastorate.
Yeah.
So let's see, so 2012 to 2014, I was in Dallas after graduation from seminary, and 2014 I started. It was my first solo pastorate, and that particular congregation, Mount Vernon, had been part of creating a homeless shelter with the community. It was a smaller community, and so all of the churches together created this homeless shelter called Lifeboat.
Mm-hmm.
They saw that there was a need, and they decided that they needed a family homeless shelter to help people have a lifeboat in their lives. And so it was pretty neat to be able to take that piece from learning from Dallas at the Stew Pot, how the homeless population in Dallas, which is has particular needs in that community, and then going to Mount Vernon and seeing a different, more farm community. But because it was, there are two highway systems that went through that area, folks would come down from Chicago to Nashville, or they'd go across from St. Louis out east. And a lot of times people would end up being homeless and staying there.
And what did you learn from the homeless people that you served?
Oh.
The stories that were told. And
a number of folks just didn't have resources. And when I say resources, it means a lot of different things. Some, it was their family situations, the way that they had grown up. They didn't know how to do certain things, so they really needed help to learn how to be able to function and do things. So both at the Stew Pot and at Lifeboat, like, they tried to give them workshops and things so they could learn a soft skill so they would be able to do whatever that was, on their own. And folks really appreciated that. I also learned that mental illness sometimes is a piece that connected for some folks that are homeless. It's not, and there are just not a lot of resources for folks who have different varying degrees of mental illness. A lot of those programs have been cut, and so folks just end up living on the streets and need help. So that was another contingency. And, and another contingency are folks who just hit a bad part in their life. It made me realize that, like we try to lump everybody together, that they're not working or they're not trying to do
No, we build
things.
stereotypes easily, yes.
But that's not what I experienced at all. Usually what I experienced was like, I really want to work, but there was some sort of something that was holding them back. Whether it was maybe they had a kid who had been sick, and so they had to keep going to the hospital. Well, they lost their job in the process because they were continuing to have to take work off, or somebody did lose a job because there were layoffs in their company, and they were rooted in that community. And so, what do you do now?
Yeah. They say that many people are like one paycheck away from homelessness, and someone in our family experienced that. The job dried up, and they suddenly found that they couldn't pay their rent and had to move. So they weren't on the street.
Right.
They were in someone else's home. But again, you cannot stereotype folks as saying they're just lazy, they're bums, they're just on the street.
It's a lot more complicated than that.
And you had a meal and scarf ministry in Mount Vernon.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
So we found that the homeless shelter did cater to one group, especially since it was a family shelter. There were some rules that had to be around that, which was to keep children safe specifically. But we also found there were folks that weren't coming to the homeless shelter, and at that particular congregation, they called the back 40. I don't know if they call that here or not, but there's a very big backyard, and they found that folks were coming in that were homeless, that were transient. And so first it started off with, well, it's really cold outside, and they had a shelter, where they'd have picnics. And we talked about it, the congregation. One particular lady, I remember, she said, well, I have scars and I like to make them.
Yeah.
Could we just put them out there and see if anybody takes them? Sure, let's try it, you know? So put some scarves out, and then somebody else was like, oh, I get socks for pretty inexpensively, because, could I put those out too? Yeah, that would be great. So we had socks and scarves out, and people were taking them.
Sure.
And one guy, this was probably my favorite moment, guy or gal left a note and said, I came through your shelter And I saw the note that said these are free to anybody, and it was a particularly bad day for me, and as I was coming back from whatever I was doing, and it was just so nice to see that I was wrapped in somebody's love and they were thinking about me, because I didn't think anybody was thinking about me.
Yeah, isn't that great?
So you just never know.
Yeah.
Small acts of kindness.
Our guest today on Encounter is Rachel Helgeson. She is the new pastor at the Northminster Presbyterian Church in Endwell. You've been there since January.
Yes.
And you're just getting to know the community now. I hope you'll get to know, let's see, I want your husband to know the jazz sessions at the Firehouse Stage. I want you to know about the Tri-Cities Opera.